Hello, I'm Dr. Jennifer Preschern. Thank you for the invitation to present at St. John's University Leadership Symposium. Today, I'm going to be giving you a short overview of my dissertation research entitled International Baccalaureate Primary Years Teachers' Perceptions on Educating Students with Dyslexia. So here's some information about me. I'm an American Speech Language Hearing Association speech language pathologist with experience also as a learning disabilities teacher. A long time ago, I went to Northwestern University and earned 2 degrees, one a master's in speech pathology and the second in learning disabilities. I went on to earn another degree in school administration from Loyola University. After working in public and private settings as a speech language pathologist and learning disabilities teacher, I worked with Eastern Illinois University to create language response to intervention benchmarking tools, which are now available through Eastern at Speech Language Literacy Lab. Then my husband had the opportunity to move to Europe for his job. He is an Austrian citizen. And so I followed him, moving to Linz, Austria, which is in the center of Europe. At that time, I worked for a short while as an international baccalaureate teacher at a primary years program, which is essentially grades K through 4. And at that time, I was hired on as an English as a second language teacher, but I told the teachers that I had expertise in dyslexia and helping students with disabilities. As a publicly funded school in Austria, this school did not have funding for any type of learning disabilities support. And I was surprised to find that many of the students were really struggling with reading, which led me curious. What about other international baccalaureate schools? What were they doing? And so this is what led me to pursue a PhD at St. John's in order to look at this question. Here I am pictured at the bottom of this screen with my family in Austria in front of the Alps. So here's an overview of my research. I chose the International Baccalaureate School System, which was founded in 1968, and it currently offers it currently has programs in over 4,964 schools in 153 different countries. I decided to focus specifically on the primary years program, which is about a K through 4 equivalent in the United States. And so the IB offers schools a framework of how to help children and what the schools need to do in order to become accredited. There is a very, very short policy statement. It's about 3 to 4 pages long that describes some basic things that schools need to have, such as learning plans, inclusion, differentiation. They encourage schools to use something called universal design for learning, which is essentially differentiating instruction. And they want schools to identify barriers to learning or things that are getting in the way of helping kids learn. Unfortunately, there's very, very little to almost no research on whether any of this is happening anywhere in the world. And so I decided that I wanted to lay the groundwork for this future research. Specifically, I wanted to focus on the area of dyslexia. And the reason for this is that it's a very common type of learning disabilities. It's the most common type. And pretty much worldwide, people have at least heard of dyslexia, even if they're not doing anything to treat it. There are also many, many methods of what to do to help children. There's neurobiological markers that have been identified. There's a lot of neuroscience and cognitive science to guide instruction. But unfortunately, schools globally still are really not utilizing this research to provide best practice for kids. And so I wanted to look at whether or not teachers within the IB system, specifically the primary years, thought that children were being adequately serviced within their schools and what barriers they might be facing. So this led me to these 3 research questions. What do the IB teachers know about dyslexia in the areas of general information, symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment? I chose this question because research globally has shown that teachers really lack understanding of what dyslexia is and what to do about it. And so I wanted to see if this was also an issue within the IB PYP school context. Second, I wanted to look at what are some barriers that are influencing education, because the IB is encouraging teachers to look at barriers to learning for students, but no research has actually been done looking at this specifically in the area of special education. And then lastly, I wanted to look to see if as teacher knowledge of dyslexia goes up, do teachers notice more barriers? Or does this somehow have an interaction? Does it predict the barriers? So I recruited using various social media through a snowball approach and a convenience sample. And so I approached several different online Facebook groups, several of which have over 40,000 members. And then from there, my sample really grew as friends referred me to their own friends. So I ended up with 228 participants, 10 of whom I removed because they only completed a few questions, leaving me with 218 teachers representing 52 different countries from 6 continents. And here is a sample of where my participants came from. It was pretty evenly distributed across the whole world, which was kind of exciting. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of my results. If you look through my PowerPoint, you will see these results fully hashed out, as well as all the numbers for these things. And so for the first research question, I wanted to know what teachers know about dyslexia. And as other research studies have shown, there's a lot of misconceptions. And so teachers believe dyslexia is caused by visual issues, reversing letters is a symptom. Some didn't know if establishing laterality was an issue. And even though neuroscience is out there showing that there's a connection, many people just didn't know if dyslexia was a neurological issue. In terms of dyslexia diagnosis, people thought that there was a need for individualized tests, but they weren't exactly sure what they looked like. There was also a lot of treatment misconceptions. And so this has also been shown in other types of research. Things like color overlays can help students. Teachers know that they need to do some sort of direct instruction, but they're not exactly sure what that looks like. So for example, 47% didn't know if sensory instruction was important, and 32% didn't know or didn't think that phonological awareness training was helpful, which is really problematic because that is one of the most important things to do helping kids with dyslexia. The second research question looked at some barriers that teachers might be facing. And so the way I determined these barriers is I created a survey for teachers. Part 1 of the survey analyzed whether teachers had a skill or a service or a policy. And the second part of the survey asked whether those things were needed. And so places where teachers said that a skill or a policy was needed, but that they didn't have it, I classified these as barriers. Whereas by contrast, if the teachers said that they had something and they didn't need it, that was not considered a barrier to education. And so this is what I ended up having here. Again, you can look through my PowerPoint for more specifics on all this, but the number one educational barrier was that teachers felt that they didn't have adequate training, which is well supported by the data that I took on the first part of my survey, which was essentially a quiz looking at teacher knowledge. So let's go through some of these with just a little more detail. So that the highest barrier to education was lack of teacher knowledge. And so teachers felt that classroom teachers didn't have knowledge to help kids, and 71% said that they themselves were not adequately prepared to help children with dyslexia. The second most commonly reported barrier was at the mesosystem, which is a little bit wider, the microsystem, which is the individual teacher, and then the mesosystem, which is more of a school-wide issue. And so teachers said that overall they had access to support personnel, but 95.2% of my participants said that their schools did not possess high-quality instructional materials for students with dyslexia. Now, to me, this is a huge problem that has been reported in several other studies, that teachers simply do not have resources to help students. And especially in some of the countries with lower resources, teachers were literally writing me emails begging me to help them find materials. And so if any of you know Richard Branson or someone with deep pockets, I really think what we need to do is create educational resources, dyslexia materials for free, so that everyone has access to these things, because it is an educational right, in my opinion, to have access to these things. They're out there. Please help me find someone, because this is going to be my life's mission, to get these resources available for all teachers. Another barrier to education, looking at a bigger picture, was at the greater community level. So at the macro system, the bigger system beyond the teacher or the school, the bigger community, which in this case was the International Baccalaureate system. And so several months ago, before I started this research, I spoke to the global head of inclusion at the IB. And she told me that teachers should use their national policy to help them guide their instruction. Now, the problem with this is that in countries like the United States or in Canada, Australia, there are policies, there are strong national policies for helping students with disabilities. Like in the United States, we have IDEA. Now, in other places, like in Austria where I live, or in most parts of Europe, there simply aren't any national policies to protect the rights of students with disabilities. So UNESCO at the UN has met, and they've created something called the Salamanca Statement, asking schools to create these sort of things and to put protections into place for students with disabilities. But these things are just not really happening. And so last year, for example, the European Dyslexia Association actually went before the European Congress and advocated for more rights for kids with dyslexia. But these things just aren't being put into place, at least not fast enough, in my opinion. And so for my participants, 64.5% said that they didn't know or didn't think the country where their school was located had any national policy on special education. And so in my opinion, the International Baccalaureate may want to take a look at this because they have these policies that schools should use national policy wherever the school is located, but teachers don't even know if they have a policy. Furthermore, 59.7% of participants reported that lack of specific IB policies and guidelines was creating a barrier to instruction for their students with dyslexia. And 71.1% reported that the IB guidelines for special education are not sufficient, in their opinion. It's creating a barrier. This is something that I thought was quite interesting, special education labeling. And so the International Baccalaureate system does not use special education labels. Instead, schools are encouraged to design instruction to meet the needs of students. But of my participants, 70% said that their schools are using some form of labeling, whether the teachers are using those words or their schools actually have some systems in place. So 80% of the schools actually have some form of system. However, this is where it gets really interesting. 66.5% of my participants didn't know or weren't sure or didn't think that they were using the same definition of dyslexia. And this is interesting. So for example, the way Britain defines dyslexia, the way the British Dyslexia Association defines dyslexia is slightly different than the way the American system works, or the International Reading Association. And so there's 35 different definitions of dyslexia floating around the world, according to some studies. And this is problematic because if we don't share one definition, we might be describing different things. And 58.8% of my participants actually said that this lack of shared definition was creating a barrier. And so for me personally, this created a barrier for me when I was working in an IB school. And so I had teachers, there was no system in place for special education identification. Teachers said, hey, Jen, help this child. This child can't read very well, or this child has dyslexia. And because there was no system in place for testing and there was no time built into the day for testing, I had to basically use hit or miss methods to figure out what was wrong or what the barrier the child was facing. And in some cases, teachers were using the words dyslexia interchangeably with things like ADHD and executive functioning disorder or dysgraphia, or in some cases, just problems with math, because we weren't sharing the same definitions of these terms. My third research question looked at whether or not, as teacher knowledge went up, whether it be by education levels or by score on the first part of my survey, which was essentially a quiz, did the barriers go up? Did perceived barriers go up? And my hypothesis was that as teacher knowledge increased, teachers would recognize more barriers. But that's not really what I found out. So overall, there was really no association with the number of barriers and teacher education level or score on the dyslexia quiz. However, as teacher knowledge went up, both on my dyslexia quiz and on having, if teachers had a higher level of education, so moving from bachelor's level to master's, teachers said that that lack of knowledge about dyslexia was less of a barrier, which is to be expected. As training goes up, as knowledge goes up, that barrier to having that knowledge goes down. Something interesting here, though, was teachers not only reported that their own that barrier decreased for themselves, they also said it decreased for others. And so, for example, if I have a master's degree, I'm less likely to say that general education teachers lack training, which is interesting. If you think about school leadership positions, teachers in leadership positions probably have a higher level of education, and if they're not recognizing that their staff is undertrained, this is going to create a problem because we need to make sure that those teachers get the training that they're asking for. And so this leads me to my conclusion here about what should be done with this research. And so actually I was invited to present next month at the Association for Central European Schools, which is a major IB organization here in Europe. And I'm going to be presenting some of this research with them. And I'm really going to be advocating for increased focus on dyslexia trainings. Perhaps I will provide some of those trainings, talking about the myths and what things need to be done. we really need to start thinking about creating a shared definition of dyslexia. Or I'm going to offer the IB just to do more research to look. Would creating some shared definitions, are teachers open for that? Is that enough? Or do there specifically need to be more policies put into place? Something that I didn't put on this slide, but I said earlier, is I really, really would love to see some more educational resources, just materials become available to teachers, because so many teachers are wanting these resources and they just don't have the funding to get these services, and these, not the services, but the actual materials, the word sorts and these highly structured content, because their countries aren't funding those things, because they're not, the countries literally aren't recognizing dyslexia as a disability. And so if any of you have connections with helping me get resources, putting them online, contacting IB schools and saying, hey, here's resources and materials, get your students reading, I would absolutely love that. So in conclusion, despite advocacy and international agreements, such as the Salamanca Statement from UNESCO, going back decades, high quality education for students with dyslexia continues to be globally problematic. And this is not just within the IB school system. My own children attend international baccalaureate schools. So I think there is a lot of positives about these schools. I don't want anyone to leave thinking that they're not a good place to educate your kids, because I'm educating my children within the system too. But like all schools everywhere, we need to do better. And we need to look out for not just the kids who are ranking #1 on the PISA tests, on those international tests, but we need to look at the kids who are struggling, because they are just as important as the ones who we're competing with at an international level. And so I really want to turn that camera around and say, hey, not just the top children, not just the ones who we're competing with, but everybody else. We want to make sure that their rights are being guaranteed as well. And so I also think that because the IB school has 158 school or countries represented worldwide, it's such a perfect place to become a world leader in modeling best practice policies for special education and dyslexia. And so it is my goal to reach out to these schools, to share my research, and to see if we can get things moving just a little bit faster to make sure that all kids are having their needs met. And so if anyone has contacts for me, or you would like me to talk with you, I would absolutely love to share my research anywhere. I've actually presented some information to school children in Pakistan about dyslexia. I'm willing to talk to kids about what dyslexia is. I'm willing to talk to teachers about what it is, to share myths, or to dispel myths and give some facts. And as I said, if anyone wants to work with me on getting materials out there, please contact me. I would absolutely love it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to meet some of you virtually soon.